Let's slowly drift back about 800 years ago, when the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and questionable hygiene, and local governments included robed nobles pointing sternly at geese. You're lying beneath a scratchy woolen blanket in a peasant hut, not much bigger than a modern kitchen pantry, possibly sharing your floor space with 3 siblings, a pig, and a tragic loaf of rye bread. It's the Middle Ages, and congratulations. You are governed by rules that make even the strangest HOA regulations seem reasonable. Let's begin, shall we, with one of my favorites, the curfew bell. Now, today the word curfew might mean be back by 10 p.m. or you're grounded, but in medieval Europe, it was far more literal. At dusk, the town bell would ring, not to tell you to get inside, but to put out your fire. Yes, your fire, the thing that kept you warm, boiled your soup, and fended off the chills of a house built largely from regret and unsealed timber. The bell, known as the couvre-feu, from which curfew comes, meant cover the fire. It was both a safety precaution and a subtle way for medieval officials to remind you that anything fun, like having warm toes, was to be regulated. So all around the village, families would toss ashes over glowing hearths, mutter a few prayers, and then huddle together in semi-darkness, smelling of damp wool and porridge that had ambitions of becoming cheese. Night was for sleeping, or repenting, or listening to your neighbour's goat snore through the paper-thin wattle and daub walls. This curfew rule wasn't merely folklore, it was law. In certain parts of England, France, and across the Holy Roman Empire, ignoring the couvre-feu could earn you more than a singed beard. Fines were issued, offenders were spoken to, not so much arrested, but definitely frowned at, which, given the oral hygiene standards, was punishment enough. And lest you think this rule was all about safety, well, some. Historians suggest it was also a handy way to prevent secret nighttime gatherings. After all, it's hard to organize a peasants' uprising or midnight ale rave without firelight. Speaking of laws seemingly designed by sleep-deprived monks, let's talk porridge. More specifically, the medieval concept of meat days and non-meat days as dictated by the church. You see, in the 13th century, spiritual purity was apparently linked to your diet. On Wednesdays, Fridays, and the entirety of Lent, meat was off limits. No sausages, no roast chicken, no fermented badger, if that was your thing. Instead, grains, vegetables, and, yes, an abundance of porridge. Now porridge, unlike bread, doesn't fight back. It's soft, it's warm, it's beige in both appearance and emotional impact. But in the Middle Ages, it became the culinary equivalent of your mother-in-law coming to stay, always there, slightly wet, and resistant to improvement no matter how much salted turnip you stirred in. But the rules, oh the rules. If you were caught eating meat on a holy day, especially during Lent, the consequences range from public shaming to having to donate extra silver to the church, a sort of spiritual toll for crispy bacon. The funny thing is, these regulations led to elaborate culinary legal gymnastics. People started reclassifying animals to make them non-meat. Beavers, for example, were considered part fish due to their aquatic lifestyle, which meant, you guessed it, you could eat their tails on Fridays. Medieval logic: if it swims, it's fish. If it swims occasionally, it's also fish. And if logic fails, just say it's a penance meal and chew regretfully. Rules like these were everywhere. How to cough during Mass, how long to bathe, briefly and with suspicion, and whether or not your socks were within moral standards. It's as if someone took a badly translated instruction manual and decided it was the foundation for civil society. But amongst the absurdity lived people just like us, tired, amused, quietly rebellious. They whispered jokes about the bishop's choice in feathers and snuck bits of sausage under piles of barley when no one holy was looking. These little acts of resistance, the illicit midnight candle, the outlawed ham biscuit, sparkled like starlight in an otherwise rule-wrapped night. And so, as the curfew bell echoes softly into the chilly medieval dusk beyond your imaginary thatched roof, let your thoughts drift like chimney smoke on a windless evening. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Close your eyes and we'll wander gently from hearthlight into something a little stranger, and perhaps a little more itchy. In the hushed corridors of the medieval world, somewhere between the clink of a chamber pot and the scratch of a quill made from a goose's backside, there existed rules so strange, so remarkably unnecessary, one might wonder if the entire system of governance was secretly run by very bored monks playing a centuries-long prank. Take, for example, one of the more infamous and impressively specific laws concerning bread. Ah yes, bread, the carb-laden cornerstone of any medieval meal, and the innocent victim of a great many ordinances. In 13th century England, the assize of bread and ale was introduced, a delightfully named law that sounds like a festive innkeeper's party invitation, but was in fact a strictly enforced set of pricing and quality controls. Bakers were legally required to adhere to fixed measures so that a loaf of bread always corresponded to its price. And if they tried to short customers on weight, well, the punishment was far from subtle. The guilty baker might find themselves dragged to the center of town and placed in the pillory. Fined? No. They were often ceremoniously tied to a cart and paraded around town, sometimes even with their underweight bread tied mockingly around their necks. A statement, certainly. One can only imagine the village children pointing and giggling at a man with a mismeasured baguette swinging from his collar like a necklace of shame. But for more serious carb infractions, there was the dreaded baker's baptism. In some places, repeat offenders were dunked, gently or not so gently, into a river via a cucking stool, a sort of medieval dunk tank without the laughter. The goal wasn't necessarily drowning, we think, just humiliation. Nothing says don't mess with flour ratios like a chili dip in the local moat. Why such fuss over bread, you ask? Well, bread was the great social equalizer. Kings had bread, peasants had bread. Granted, the peasants' loaves were more likely to contain bits of straw and speculative insects. But still, everyone ate it. A bad loaf could foment a riot. Or worse, produce a conversation. And no lord wanted either. But the absurdity didn't end at baked goods. The Middle Ages adored rules with the specificity of a tax auditor and the moral convictions of a nervous bishop. In medieval France, ladies were encouraged, no expected, to cover their hair with veils, wimples, or hoods. A strand of disobedient hair peeking out from beneath fabric wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a spiritual hazard. Clerics wrote lengthy treatises suggesting that uncovered female hair could drive men to lustful distraction, as if a single glimpse of a woman's ear might cause spontaneous combustion in the choir stalls. And then there was the law of shoes, pointy shoes to be precise. In the 14th century, the fashionable elite of Europe began wearing shoes called poulaines, with tips so long and curled they required string or chains to anchor them to the knees. Delightful for flirting, disastrous for stares. But as their Length increased, so did clerical disapproval, and soon laws were passed to limit the length of a man's shoe according to his social rank. Nobles could wear poulaines with up to 2 feet of pointy glory, but a mere tradesman, poor soul, limited to more modest, unremarkable footwear, the crocs of the day, if you will. There was also a curious monastic rule. We don't wish to name names, but the Cistercians were enthusiastic participants, which dictated that monks avoid laughter. Not all laughter, mind you, just unbridled mirth. Giggling was frowned upon. A hearty belly laugh, positively scandalous. The idea was that spiritual discipline demanded solemnity. After all, how could one fully contemplate the fall of man while snorting through his nose at Brother Thomas's imitation of an inebriated bishop? Still, monks being monks, and humans being humans, it's hard not to imagine soft chuckles reverberating beneath the cloister arches, followed by the quick scuffle of sandals on stone as laughter was swallowed in a guilty cough. Rules, it seems, were everywhere, from your bread to your boots, from your hairstyle to your ability to not giggle during evening prayers. The Middle Ages were not lacking in imagination, nor in bureaucracy. But don't worry, we're just warming up. Let your eyes rest now, soft and heavy. We're edging further into history's forgotten footnotes and sleepy side characters. And trust me, the next bit, it gets even stranger. If you were a medieval peasant, and you woke up one breezy morning whistling a jaunty tune while strolling past your neighbour's hedges, there's a slight chance you might have committed a crime. Not whistling, that was mostly fine, unless your tune was suspiciously happy during times of plague or taxes. No, your true transgression would be if your neighbour's hedge was taller than allowed. Yes, hedge height. An actual regulated concern in some medieval communities. You see, the Middle Ages were not all sword fights and Gregorian chants, though those existed in surprisingly similar frequencies. Much of medieval life was a steady juggling act of oddly specific restrictions. Picture a world where you could be fined not for thievery, but for baking your bread in the wrong shape, where your hat, the beacon atop your humble noggin, was telling everyone your precise social station, whether you liked it or not. Let us consider the absurdly authoritative world of sumptuary laws. These laws, dreamed up by people who clearly spent too much time staring out castle windows while wearing fur indoors, dictated who could wear what, when, and in what shade of blue. The idea was to prevent lower classes from impersonating nobility through, say, an unbecomingly fancy tunic or a pair of boots that said, "I have opinions." For instance, in 14th century England, the law helpfully clarified that only the king, his immediate family, and people with genuinely fabulous pedigrees could wear cloth of gold or purple silk. Purple, as you might recall, was notoriously difficult to produce, each royal robe requiring thousands of crushed sea snails. Imagine risking your life for that level of fashion drama, only to find out you'd accidentally matched the queen and were therefore subject to a fine, or worse, public shaming. Speaking of shame, let's glance delicately toward the rules of feasting. Meals were possibly the only time a peasant got a break, if chewing barley stew qualifies as a respite. But even here, the rules followed. At a banquet, you couldn't just eat what you wanted. Oh no. Protocol dictated that geese were for gentlemen, eel pies for ecclesiastics, and if you were caught nicking a hedgehog roast reserved for the bishop, you might end up blessed with a mild excommunication and a swift trip to the stocks. Do you have a favourite spoon? Perhaps one that feels just right in your soup. In medieval England, bringing your own spoon to dinner wasn't quirky, it was mandatory. Personal cutlery was a sign of civilization, though forks hadn't quite made it to most tables yet. Eating meat with fingers was common, provided one followed proper three-finger etiquette. That's right, only the thumb, forefinger and middle finger were designated for meat handling. Use your pinky and you'd risk being mistaken for a wild barbarian, or worse, a Frenchman. Then there were the animal laws. Now, you might assume animals had free-range lives, frolicking merrily through hayfields. Not quite. In some towns, pigs had to wear wooden yokes around their necks to keep them from nosing into trouble, or into someone's cabbage patch. If your pig bit someone, you could be hauled in as an accessory to bacon battery. And yes, there were actual animal trials. One documented case involved a pig who was hanged for murder, a very solemn affair with witnesses, a priest, and presumably one very confused porcine criminal. But animals weren't the only ones, struggling with unusual expectations. Bell ringers, for example, had enormous seasonal responsibilities, not just for summoning people to prayer, but for chasing away storms. It was believed that the mighty din of church bells could scare off thunder, or at least give it second thoughts. Bell ringers would go clanging about during ominous weather, often atop trembling towers with little more than their faith and damp boots keeping them from becoming weather vanes. The scent of awry superstition lingers here, for doctors especially, in the belief that disease travelled through smells, miasmas. They carried bouquets or wore long-nosed masks stuffed with herbs. But the real kicker, if your town's plague doctor showed up looking perky, you were in serious trouble. They didn't come for checkups. They came for last rites with a side of aromatic rosemary. And amidst all of this fluttering fabric, bellowing pigs, and tightly monitored sweaters, most people managed to live entire lives without knowing literacy, hot baths, or what their face looked like in a flattering mirror. They managed joy in the crackle of fires, the rare feast when goose was actually available, and the moment when the official came by to measure hedges, and found yours pleasingly compliant. Let your thoughts drift there for a moment. The cool, mossy stone of a village wall, an innocent pig trotting by in a wooden yoke, a trumpet note high above as a bell ringer chases away a cloud. You observe it all in quiet wonder, the rules swirling around like snippets of forgotten songs. And just as sleep licks at the corners of your thoughts, stir gently. There's more still to unfold. Just a turn down the next cobbled street. In the Middle Ages, you didn't politely ask someone what they did for work. You looked at the colour of their hat. Yes, their hat. The sumptuary laws, one of history's more fashionably absurd forms of control, were rules designed less to guide the masses and more to make sure people remembered their place. Social climbing was all well and good in theory, but heaven forbid a commoner wore velvet or silk. That would simply be chaos. Horses would gallop sideways, shoemakers would address nobles directly, and entire towns might spontaneously sit at the Lord's table. Can't have that, so medieval lawmakers took it upon themselves to make fashion a felony. Certain fabrics, colours, and types of footwear were legally exclusive to the elite. That purple-drenched robe you saw in a tapestry, royalty only. The rich, saturated, sleepy hues we now associate with bedtime pajamas were once treacherous territory. In 14th century England, a law passed under King Edward III stated that only knights and upward could wear cloth worth more than 6 shillings and 8 pence a yard. That's roughly one particularly snazzy sheep's worth of fabric. Meanwhile, commoners had to stick to the earth tones of obligation: brown, beige, grey, everything that screamed, I serve soup and don't ask questions. But it wasn't just about thread count. No. For instance, in Florence, there was such anxiety about upward dressing women that married ladies were forbidden from wearing buttons. Yes, buttons, made of precious metals or with too many pearls. Heaven forbid your cuff sparkle more than your husband's income. In France, things took a turn for the ornithological when the possession of ermine fur, a favorite of nobility, was limited exclusively to those of pure aristocratic blood. Now, if you're unfamiliar, ermine is just a fancy way of saying winter stoat. Imagine getting arrested in 1382 because your cloak screamed, "I brutally conquered a tiny weasel," and your bloodline screamed, "I run a small chicken farm." Of course, enforcing these rules meant that authorities needed to keep track of who was improperly fashionable. Enter the medieval version of the fashion police, who, lacking Vogue or Instagram, had to rely on spying, gossip, and occasional wardrobe inspections. Somehow, someone was being paid to barge into a villager's home and declare, "This tunic is too luxurious for your profession, Gregory the baker, unless you've recently risen to dukehood without telling anyone." And don't even think about shoe length. Yes, your feet could technically get you arrested. The poulain, a shoe with such an absurdly long point at the toe that it could double as a fencing weapon, became wildly popular in 15th century Europe. The length was supposed to represent your status. The higher your rank, the longer your toe. It was a time when a man's pointy shoes were truly his pointiest asset. In Poland and England, the poulain's growth became so alarming that laws had to restrict its length by class. Peasants were limited to 6 inches. Merchants got 12. Nobles could go full clown show with 20-inch toe extensions, curling up like a sleepy fiddlehead fern. Tripping hazards. Undeniable. Fabulous. Equally so. But why all these rules? Why all this fabric policing, toe measuring and fur checking? It was a nervous way to maintain the illusion of order. The Middle Ages ran on rigid hierarchies, like a very uncomfortable dinner party, where everyone had assigned seating and no one dared switch chairs. If a servant wore silk, a scribe wore crimson, or a cobbler walked in pointy shoes too bold for his birthright, everything felt a little too revolutionary. So society reached for laws wrapped in lace and embroidery. Yet people always found ways around it. Enter the black market of fashion, where tailors quietly added an extra pearl, a sly silk lining, or a longer than legal shoe point if you slipped them enough coin. Rule breaking, after all, is humanity's original hobby. As the candle of the evening burns lower, let's leave behind the itchy tunics and cautiously fashionable peasants. For now, rest easy knowing that modern fashion disasters are mere blips compared to the great shoe scandals of 1437. And when you dream, perhaps dreams swaddled in velvet, you totally have the legal right to wear. Now come, let us wander into a world where not just clothes, but even mealtimes were tightly regulated. In the flickering candlelight of medieval Europe, a man with muddy boots and a slightly crooked hat might pause and wonder, am I legally allowed to wear this color of shoe on a Wednesday? In this dreamlike realm of curious customs, not everything was as simple as it seemed, because you see, in the Middle Ages, even getting dressed could make or break your entire social standing. It all starts with a little something called sumptuary laws. These were the fashion police of yore, except instead of citing you for wearing socks with sandals, they might fine, imprison, or publicly shame you for daring to wear silk if you were a mere merchant and not a proper noble with an entire coat of arms and at least one tapestry in your dining hall. You see, back then, clothes weren't just clothes. They were neon signs of your place in the feudal pecking order. Blue, that was fine. Deep, glorious Tyrian purple? Absolutely not, unless you were royalty, or at least nobles. So noble their family trees had branches doing yoga. Even shoes weren't spared. Enter the curious world of the poulaines, those infamous pointy-toed shoes that looked like someone had tried to turn footwear into a jousting lance. These elegant dangers were the medieval equivalent of saying, "Look at me, I'm very important and possibly quite irresponsible with my coin purse." The tips of these shoes could extend up to 24 inches and were often stuffed with moss or whalebone to hold their proud, silly shape. If you were a peasant caught in such frivolity, don't worry, your fine would only cost roughly 7 years of grain. Unless you think this was just about fashion, remember, in towns like Florence and London, sumptuary laws could dictate how many rings you were allowed to wear at once, how wide your sleeves could billow, beware the wide-sleeve police, and even the type of embroidery you could flaunt on your doublet. Displaying too much luxury was considered not only immoral, but also dangerously ambitious. After all, if commoners started dressing like nobles, how would anyone know who to bow to? Chaos would ensue. Dogs might take up falconry. Absolute bedlam. Of course, timing was everything. In London during the 14th century, if your sleeves were wider than 12 inches, you weren't trendy. You were criminal. And it wasn't just the elites imposing these rules either. Sometimes entire town councils would decree what their citizens could or couldn't wear to festivals. Heaven forbid a brewer's daughter outshine the mayor's wife at the midsummer fair. That'll get you banned from the maypole. But fashion wasn't the only arena of regulated absurdity. There existed in several regions rules about how food could be cooked, served, and even when it could be eaten. In the early Middle Ages, some towns banned meat eating on certain days, not just for religious reasons, but because they believed excessive consumption of salted pork might heat the blood too much. Heated blood, they said, leads to unruly thoughts, like poetry or defiance. Best to cool yourself with porridge and prayer. Even bread had a bit of bureaucracy baked in. Bakers in England, for instance, operated under the Assize of Bread and Ale, a law which declared not only how much a loaf should weigh, but also its price, based on the going rate of wheat. If a baker was caught shortchanging the villagers, they weren't just given a slap on the wrist. Oh no, misbehaving bakers could be dragged through the streets with their subpar loaves hung around their neck, like a carbohydrate-themed necklace of shame. And should you wish to play a musical instrument to soothe your soul or entertain your cat, best make sure you weren't an unlicensed minstrel. Many towns required musicians to belong to a guild before they were allowed to pluck so much as a lute string at a tavern. Wandering, unsanctioned performers were often shooed away or grimly conscripted into the local army. One too many rebellious ballads, and suddenly you're issuing marching orders with a tambourine. So the next time you slip into your comfiest pajamas, eat toast at the questionable hour of 3 a.m., or hum a tune while walking through your kitchen. Think of the medieval folk who couldn't wear that, eat that, or whistle that without risking the wrath of a parchment-wielding scribe. And as breezes stir the cobwebs of antiquity, let's drift gently toward a tale unfolding in the cobbled silence of medieval curfews, when bells tolled not just for time, but for obedience, in the silvery hush of a candlelit monastery, where the wind tapped politely on ancient stained glass, and the ink in monks' quills froze mid-sentence in winter. There came one of the strangest and most delicately absurd rules ever etched upon parchment. No laughter in cloisters. Yes, laughter, outright banned. Outlawed like a peasant's pig rooting in aristocratic tulips, You see, in the determined effort to cultivate holiness, monks of the Middle Ages adopted rules so strict even their eyebrows weren't entirely free to wiggle. The rule of St. Benedict, which governed many monastic orders, considered laughter a sign of frivolity and distraction from the divine. In an environment where silent reflection was the aim, a well-timed guffaw could unravel 6 months of spiritual focus, to say nothing of knocking over a spit bucket in nearby silence. Imagine, if you will, Brother Alcuin, suppressing a chuckle in the scriptorium as Brother Cuthbert miscopied "Year of our Lord" into "Yeast of our lard" for the 3rd time that week. Not that anyone could correct him aloud. Speech was rationed like fine wine, and bursts of hilarity even thirstier. There's something deliciously ironic in the idea that monastic silence, meant to purify the soul, also magnified every single humorous misstep. A dropped communion wafer, a hiccup during Gregorian chanting, or a pigeon landing definitively on the bishop's bald head during evensong. These petty details became full-blown temptations to the poor monks, who weren't allowed even a polite snort. But it wasn't just monks who battled strange laughter laws. Outside the abbey walls, in the grand courts of kings and queens, you might suspect the mood would be jollier. Court jesters, after all, existed to make noble folk wheeze and wheeze until their corsets unbuckled themselves in surrender. Yet, even jesters had rules, a perilous paradox, given their job was chaos. A jester was allowed to mock anyone, except the gravy situation, or diplomacy, or His Majesty's new haircut, which was absolutely not applied using melted wax and the sharp end of a boot knife. Step over these invisible comedic lines, and your next performance might occur without the benefit of a head. But wait, you ask, politely nestled into your pillow. Why all this clamping down on joy, in a time already riddled with plagues, cold porridge, and shoes made of wood that multiplied blisters like biblical fish? Well, friend, in the Middle Ages, laughter was often associated with folly, an excess of emotion that lowered the soul and lifted the hemline. The Church, ever watchful of spiritual purity, encouraged solemnity. And besides, if you were laughing, you might forget how close you were to excommunication or dysentery. There were even medical theories, yes, medical ones, that proposed laughter could unhinge the body's hot, cold, dry, wet balance of humours. Humour, as it turns out, was no laughing matter. If you laughed too hard, you might expel too much phlegm, or worse yet, draw in excessive air, upsetting the body's gentle equilibrium and inviting in demons via the nose. Quite an entrance. And not all laughter was created equal. High-born ladies were expected to issue delicate titters. No full-lung honks or knee-thumping yelps. How uncouth. Meanwhile, peasants might be punished for merrymaking on inappropriate days, like saints' feast days, days of penance, or Tuesdays, just in case. Of course, humanity being as stubbornly tickled by its own absurdity as ever, people found ways to indulge their giggles. Puppet shows, for instance, became a loophole. The Church frowned less upon fabric-based mockery, perhaps because the devil in puppet form looked adequately silly and therefore spiritually neutered. People gathered in village squares to chuckle behind their hands as strings wobbled and wooden jaws clacked out mild insult comedy. And let us not forget the Feast of Fools, a once-annual festival during which roles flipped. Choir boys became bishops, and actual bishops looked on with a mild eye twitch. Laughter broke free momentarily, like a cork, popping from a bottle sealed with solemnity, though the rules remained on paper, decreeing who could laugh, when, how, and at what decibel, all across Europe, From drafty stone halls to soggy haylofts, people kept finding ways to smile, even if just inside, even if just briefly. And so, as laughter tiptoed carefully through the corridors of convents and cracked the silence of cathedrals just long enough to warm the stone, another strange rule lingered on the horizon. About socks. Gloriously woolly, entirely itchy socks. By lantern light and the creaking timber groan of yet another castle that's slightly draftier than advertised, we drift now to the curious case of medieval sumptuary laws, the Middle Ages' very own fashion police, but with fewer tickets and more beheadings, or at least sternly worded fines. Imagine, if you will, a tailor in late 14th century England, hard-working, nimble-fingered, and tragically burdened by a client who insists upon wearing squirrel fur, despite having only the social status of, say, a cabbage farmer. The tailor sighs. He knows the law. That fur is strictly for nobles, unless of course the squirrel gave enthusiastic consent, and the farmer is feeling quite fancy today. But alas, the authorities weren't especially known for flexible interpretations. Sumptuary laws, derived from the Latin word sumptus, meaning expense, were less about protecting fashion aesthetics and more about defending the rigid social hierarchy against the terrifying threat of upward sartorial mobility. The idea was simple. If peasants could look like lords, the entire feudal system might collapse under the weight of excessive embroidery. In England's Statutes of Apparel under Queen Elizabeth II, a dizzying array of fashion restrictions were laid out, making it entirely illegal for commoners to wear crimson silk, velvet doublets, or anything that might suggest you belonged at the royal court, rather than, say, ankle-deep in turnips. You could be fined or even face jail time for daring to strut about in the wrong colour, especially if that colour was purple. Ah, purple. The colour of emperors and people who could afford single-use snails. You see, Tyrian purple dye was made from thousands of tiny sea snails whose contribution to fashion was both noble and terminal. As each drop of dye was painstakingly harvested, picture monks weeping into buckets of mollusks, the resulting cost ensured that only the wealthiest nobles, and perhaps their very lucky cats, could afford a cloak in that shade. But it wasn't just England getting persnickety about petticoats. France, Italy, and even the Holy Roman Empire caught the fashion fever too. In Florence, for example, a city known for its art, banking, and general enthusiasm for pickled vegetables, laws banned women from wearing buttons made of precious metals. Why? Because buttons were scandalously decorative. Much too frivolous. It was, one assumes, the medieval equivalent of wearing gold-plated shoelaces to the farmer's market. The logic, if we're generous enough to call it that, was to keep everyone dressed according to their rank. So a butcher could wear plain wool, a knight, silk-lined cloaks, and royalty, well, nothing short of bejeweled peacock feathers and entire miniatures of St. George stitched into their undergarments would suffice. Of course, the problem with dictating wardrobe by legal decree is that people are surprisingly stubborn about their right to wear novelty hats, and thus began the age-old tradition of dressing ridiculously in secret. Imagine a group of peasants having a themed dinner party in a hidden cellar, each of them donning velvet tunics and feathered caps, giggling madly as they sip cider from goblets they borrowed from the baron's pantry. Enforcement of these laws was famously ineffective. Town officials were often too busy collecting taxes, chasing goats out of courthouses, or writing angsty poetry about the plague to inspect every citizen's hemline. Still, the fear of retribution lingered, especially for aspiring merchants who were just successful enough to afford a fur-trimmed cloak, but not high-ranked enough to survive a noble throwing a tantrum about it. It's a strange thing, how throughout history, societies have feared not the sword, but the sleeve, the bezel on the belt buckle, the improper width of a velvet cuff. These tiny textile rebellions held an almost mythic power. Clothes, after all, weren't just something you wore. They were declarations, boundaries, whispered prayers of self-worth in wool and lace. And yet, even among all this fashion-fueled fuss, there was one unspeakable horror guaranteed to unite lords and peasants alike in their dread. The dreaded, regulated undergarment. Ah, but that, dear listener, is a tale of modesty, mischief, and medieval linen. Best left for the gentle hush of what's to come. Somewhere between the dread-inducing clang of a monastery bell and the distant scent of sheep who've been upwind for far too long, lay a curious concept that kept many medieval minds in line. Sumptuary laws. A delightful little tangle of legislated fashion. These were rules designed not to make life simpler, but to ensure everyone dressed exactly as confusingly as the ruling class desired. You see, in our age of well-meaning chaos, we take for granted the freedom to dress like a Victorian ghost on a Tuesday, or a sentient yoga mat, depending on your mood. But in the Middle Ages, such self-expression could lead to fines, public shame, or a stern glare from your local baron, which frankly was worse than the fine. Sumptuary laws were medieval society's way of saying, "We appreciate that you're doing well, but please stop dressing like you're someone." These rules dictated what colors you could wear, what fabrics you might enjoy, and precisely how flashy your sleeves could be, before society collectively decided you were getting too big for your breeches, literally. Royalty, of course, could dip themselves head to toe in silk and twinkle like a chandelier if they pleased. But should a merchant who'd struck gold in the spice trade dare to dabble in ermine-trimmed sleeves or a hat with a bit too much feather? That was considered blatant social heresy. Take 14th century England. King Edward III, likely tired of being visually mistaken for a cloth merchant at Sunday Mass, passed laws which clarified that only nobles above a specific rank could wear fur, silk, or cloth of gold. Commoners were encouraged to look exactly like commoners, lest they forget their place and try something wild, like aspirations. It was not only about fabric, of course. Even colors were suspect. Purple, perilously imperial. Scarlet, scandalously splendid. Wearing them out of turn was like performing Shakespeare with socks on your hands. Technically doable, but guaranteed to elicit a frown. And it wasn't just England. In medieval Florence, festive birthplace of pointy shoes and even pointier politics, you'd find a dense tapestry of laws attempting to combat the scandalous decadence of puffy sleeves and low necklines. Officials dispatched sumptuary inspectors, whose job was to wander the streets, presumably squinting at skirts and measuring neckline depths with alarming precision. A nosy neighbor, but legally sanctioned. By the way, in case you thought pettiness was not a civic virtue, Florence had a solution. You could report your fashionably deviant neighbors. Yes, you could tattle on Signora Bellini for daring to wear Venetian brocade after the feast of St. Crispin, and the city might reward your morality with a tidy little commission. It was morality meets voyeurism, meets a very dull detective drama. But even more amusing, though perhaps less amusing for the wearer, was the idea of clothing fines. If your belt looked too ornate or your shoes had offensively curly toes, officials might hit you with a sumptuary bill that equaled a month's wages. Imagine it. Fined 50 florins because your boots curled like a cinnamon roll. Stylish, yes. Legal, absolutely not. And while men were certainly part of this itchy fabric drama, women were often the more heavily scrutinized. Velvet bodices, gem-studded hairnets, gowns that swished a bit too loudly, all juicy targets for court etiquette and censure. All to uphold an illusion of modesty that had less to do with virtue and more to do with everyone staying in their visually assigned box. One can almost picture the daily anxiety, standing before your mirrorless wall, wondering if your trim was 2 inches too elaborate, or whether that new satchel might scream aspiring middle class. And what a scream it would be, whispered about in taverns, judged silently at market, and possibly scolded by a village priest who swore he wasn't looking, but clearly was. These laws, of course, often failed. Humans, after all, have eternally enjoyed looking moderately fabulous. People snuck in silks, wore blackwork lace when no one was looking, and unrepentantly added an extra feather when they felt particularly sassy. Regulations may hem in behavior, but fashion, even then, was a quiet rebellion stitched in every seam. And so, as lanterns flicker low and the clouds wrap their lazy arms around the moon, we drift forward to another peculiar custom of medieval life. Leave your fur-trimmed cloaks behind, unless you're nobility, in which case, carry on. And tiptoe now into the curious realm of edible table laws. Yes, food too had rules. In the velvety hush of a medieval evening, when the sun forgot to set and simply slipped away behind thatched rooftops, let us wander into the realm of fashion. Not the glossy kind you find in a modern-day magazine, but the stitched, feathered, and highly regulated parade of fabrics worn by the hierarchy of yesteryear. Yes, dear listener, it is time to tug gently at the threadbare hem of sumptuary laws. Picture a cobblestone street in 14th century England. A modest tailor, eyes weary from squinting at velvet seams, mutters under his breath, "No ermine for that baker's son, or I'll answer to the sheriff again." You see, it wasn't simply about what people chose to wear. It was who was allowed to. And the answer was usually, not you. Sumptuary laws were the medieval version of a dress code written by someone who had only ever dressed in brocade and suspicion. To wear certain colors, materials, or silhouettes was more than inappropriate. It was criminal. Long before fashion police became a tongue-in-cheek term, actual authorities were tasked with sniffing out sleeve lengths that came too close to nobility. For instance, only those of noble blood could wear purple silk in many parts of Europe. Purple, you ask? That regal shade made from the mucus of thousands of predatory snails? Precisely. To don purple if weren't royal was like slapping a crown on your head and declaring yourself king of the communal outhouse. Audacious, illegal. Even fur, that cozy barrier between body and drafty stone wall, fell under harsh scrutiny. In Florence, the city of banks and very expressive statues, the government inspected closets. Ermine must be a count. Squirrel fur? Acceptable if you were middle class and preferably humble about it. One particularly curious rule from England was that a man's shoes should not have toes longer than 2 inches, unless, of course, he held a certain title. As a result, nobles pranced about with shoe tips that stretched out to 6 or even 12 inches, curling like shrimp tails and tripping hazards. To walk with dignity, one needed both excellent balance and a helpful servant to manage the laces. Fashion, it seems, was also a competitive sport, but the restrictions didn't just apply to what was worn, they governed how much. There were regulations about the number of garments one could own. Too many silk tunics and the local magistrate might assume you're either dressing above your station or up to something. Women's clothing wasn't spared the legislative embroidery either. In some cities, the size and decoration of a woman's headdress were tightly controlled. In 15th century Burgundy, one's hat could shoot up like a Gothic cathedral, provided you married sufficiently well. Otherwise, it was a bonnet and a reminder: know your place. These laws weren't only about envy or aesthetics, though they certainly had a touch of both. They were designed to keep society firmly stratified, like a well-layered pie at a feudal banquet. Peasants on the bottom, nobles on top, and clergy somewhere in the mysterious middle, usually judging everyone else. There is, however, something deliciously human about the way people circumvented such fashion rules. Peasants might dye their tunics with onion skins or berries to get the noble look at peasant prices. A merchant might sneak in a bolt of contraband velvet under a shipment of cheese. Even nuns occasionally wore scandalous petticoats beneath their habits. Hidden rebellions swishing quietly down cold cloisters. Over time, these laws became harder to uphold, especially as the middle class rose and money began to confuse the rigid order of social roles. After all, if a brewer could afford velvety robes and elaborate codpieces, and paid his taxes faithfully, was it truly a crime that his family goose wore a tiny velvet cloak too? Predictably, many of these laws faded into irrelevance, tripped over by the very spectacle of the fashions they tried to contain. Because no matter the century, humans have always loved to dress just slightly out of bounds, a stitch ahead of the rules. And so, as the night air settles through our imaginary window of time, fluttering the candle flame, we close the wardrobe of medieval fashion, a strange cabinet of forbidden hats and ambitious trousers. With that, let's gather our cloaks, legal or otherwise, and tiptoe towards something even more peculiar. The world of animal trials and the mice who stood accused. In the moonlit hush of medieval Europe, where the air smelled faintly of damp stone and sheep, and where candlelight flickered like timid thoughts, there unfolded a curious rule so peculiar, so head-tiltingly specific, that even the lice might have raised a microscopic eyebrow: the rule of the goosefoot tax. Let's drift now to the quaint domain of 14th century France, a charming place if you weren't being taxed to high heaven, or executed. The lords of the land, ever inventive in their pursuit of coin, began enforcing what was known in some parts as la dîme de loi, the goose tithe. You see, if your household owned geese, those honking, feathery watchdogs with anger issues, you owed your lord more than gratitude. Every year, you were required to pay a goosefoot as tax. That's right, not a whole goose, not even an egg, just the webbed foot. Now, there were two possibilities for how this tax came into being. Either someone misunderstood a nobleman's dinner order, "Bring me goose feet," and the peasantry thought it was a ritual offering. Or more likely, a clever scribe wrote, "Tax, 1 goose," and a thrifty baron altered it with a quill flick to read 1 goose foot, thinking they'll never dare cheat with a partial bird. Oh, but cheat they did. To avoid sacrificing a perfectly good goose, which, mind you, was both a source of eggs and an early warning system for intruders, peasants began crafting fake goose feet, out of wood, out of mud and string. Some of them were masterpieces, miniature sculptures so detailed they could have been used in puppet theatre. One particularly inventive woman in Brittany was caught boiling a carrot into the right shape. The bailiffs were not amused. As strange as it sounds, medieval taxation often veered into the whimsical. Monarchs would tax the number of windows in your home, the width of your fireplace, or even the number of wheels on your cart. Why? because abstract taxes are harder to argue with. Try telling a taxman your fireplace doesn't truly reflect your wealth due to emotional distance. But the goosefoot tax had a peculiar effect. It led to the first recorded case of foot fraud. Villagers would swap goose feet to avoid paying, much like playground trading cards. Stories spread of black markets with sacks full of severed feet. Very smelly, very illegal, and very much in line with medieval standards of sanity. Of course, the church had thoughts. Theologians debated whether offering a goosefoot counted as a partial sacrifice, and if it displeased the divine. Monks, ever the pragmatic sort, merely noted which villagers seemed to have geese that mysteriously walked with a limp. Now, we can't properly close this moment in history without addressing the question hissing quietly in the shadows. Why a foot? Why not a feather, or a song, or a polite honk? Some speculate it was symbolic, a gesture of loyalty, a part of the whole, the sacrifice of movement to remain rooted to the manor. Or maybe, just maybe, the baron in question simply had an unsettling fondness for pickled goose toes. We may never know. What we do know is that the absurdity of this tax left behind something slightly sweeter, a tradition. In some rural corners of France, long after the tax was lifted, villagers would leave a single goosefoot at the base of a statue or a chapel as an offering of thanks, not to their lords, but to the geese themselves, those flapping barnyard sentries who gave so much and never once asked to be taxed. And with that odd little detail feathered into place, let your mind drift along cobbled paths, past ancient barns and sleepy villages, where another peculiar decree waits patiently to be remembered. Picture now a soft drizzle falling across a timber-framed village in 14th century England. The thatched roofs dripping quietly as smoke curls lazily from chimneys into the slate-grey sky. The cows are chewing cud with monumental slowness, as if they too have grown philosophical. And in the town square stands something slightly mystifying. At first glance, it resembles a birdhouse on stilts. But no, dear guest of the imagination, it's a communal shoe-checking station. Not for comfort or style, mind you. Oh no. This peculiar structure exists to enforce one of the more preposterous regulations of medieval fashion, the pointiness of one's footwear. Yes, you heard that right. Welcome to the age of the poulains, a form of shoe that could stretch outward from the toes like the beak of an overly self-important parrot. By the late 1300s, noblemen were tripping gracefully through court with shoes so long and curled they had to be tied to their knees to avoid mortal embarrassment, or just mortal injury. The ruling opinion, backed by divine right and questionable taste, held that only the higher ranks could sport the truly exaggerated points. Laws were passed limiting shoe length based on social class. A mere peasant? Your toes could dare only a modest half-inch of snobbery before the fashion constables, delightfully real in some towns, might cite you for unauthorized pointiness. A knight might flaunt 2 inches, dukes perhaps 10. And if you were royalty, your shoes might drag behind you like the tail of a mythical foot dragon, signaling the majesty of your bunions to all. No one, apparently, questioned why society collectively decided to measure status by how likely one was to trip over doorway thresholds. But the point, no pun intended, was symbolism. Longer shoes meant you obviously weren't doing any useful labor. The absurdity of rendering yourself unable to walk properly was precisely the upper-class appeal. Look upon my curling shoes, ye scullions, and despair, for I have people who stir porridge on my behalf. Clerics, naturally, were appalled. Shoes were becoming the very symbol of sin and vanity. In one particularly animated sermon, A bishop in England compared poulaines to the horns of the devil, probably while wearing shoes that looked like a modest loaf of bread. The church tried to ban them periodically, but fashion is a stubborn beast, especially when it has curled leather laces and jingling bells at the end. Now, navigating the cobblestone streets of Malmesbury or Splot-on-Dale in shoes that doubled as fancy tripping hazards began to create real logistical issues. Cobbler guilds soon had to specialize in balancing form and survivability. Some town councils even employed shoe-length inspectors, the medieval equivalent of a parking enforcement officer, only less loved and carrying a measuring stick. Imagine the poor soul in charge of that. On paper, it sounds simple. Determine whether Henry the Shearer's shoes are exceeding his status. In practice, it meant squatting in the mud beside a man's feet, measuring his leather points with a resigned sigh, while chickens pecked at your cathedral-backed knees. Of course, some noble men, not to be outdone, commissioned double-jointed poulaines that could fold upward like the neck of a decorative goose. A few even had them gilded with precious metals. It's unclear how often these were worn, or whether anyone could actually walk in them without summoning divine help. But we do have paintings, and paintings, as you know, never fib. Eventually, the trend wore thin, quite possibly due to the rising number of twisted ankles and the inconvenient way they rendered sword fighting comically ineffective. Imagine two squires trying to duel in shoes that flopped like fish every time they twisted their hips. Romantic in law, ridiculous in reality. So, as the fashion changed, so too did the rules. The shoes shortened. Sensibility crept quietly back in like a cat, who knew better than to get involved earlier. But for a brief, glittering, and rather unstable chapter of history, the length of your shoes was the hill you stylishly staggered upon. And now, as night softly hums beyond your window, let us take one more sleepy step forward, to a rule involving more fabric than you'd ever wrap around practical logic, and a hat so complicated, nobility had to sit down just to balance it. By the flickering light of a beeswax candle, rare and quite honestly, a status symbol unless you were a monk, we now tiptoe into the unspoken peculiarities of medieval fashion law. The inexplicably regulated world of pointy shoes, purple robes, and troublesome hats so wide they could block doorways. It turns out that back in the Middle Ages, your outfit wasn't just a reflection of your personal taste. It was very much a matter of government concern. Sumptuary laws, as they were so loftily called, were medieval society's way of shouting, "Know your place," but in legalese, and usually with fines. These laws declared who could wear what fabrics, which colours, how much fur one might dabble in, and more eccentricity, a sort of wardrobe apartheid, if you will, but with extra lace limits. So let's take a nighttime stroll into 14th century England, where the gentry are bustling around in what appear to be flamboyant curtains with sleeves, and a man's honour might hinge upon the length of his shoe. Ah yes, the shoes, known as krakos or poulaines. These were long, pointy-toed slippers named after Krakow in Poland, where the fashion originated. The toes could extend several inches on purpose, to a comical and dangerous degree. Some noblemen had their poulaines so excessively long, they had to stuff the toes with moss, or even tie the ends to their knees with little chains to walk properly. The church, predictably, denounced them as tools of vanity and suspected witchcraft. Fashionable, yes, but suitable for the narrow spiral staircases of castle life. Deeply debatable. To prevent everyone from engaging in competitive toe lengthening, laws were passed limiting how long a person's shoe points could extend. based on social class. A prince might twirl in 12 inches of polished leather, while the common cobbler was legally confined to a modest and stubby 2. One poor fellow was even reportedly fined for flamboyant footwear unbecoming of a cooper. Clothing colours, too, were strictly policed. Deep purple or royal blue were reserved for literal royalty, thanks to the difficulty and expense of making those dyes. Think slugs and fermented urine with a splash of snail. So if you wandered into a village party doused in violet velvet, local officials might assume you robbed a countess, or worse, pretended to be one. And then, of course, came the Battle of Hats. Hats were much more than sun shields. They were walking resumes. Suppose you're a baker. You could wear a felt cap. If you're a baron, feathered velvet, brim sweeping a full dinner queue. But get this. In 1463, English law required every male over 6 years of age, unless they were royalty or clergy, to wear a woolen cap on Sundays or pay a fine. Why Sunday? Well, presumably, because that's when everyone was out strutting through market squares, freshly bathed and gloriously observable. Interestingly, the caps had to be made in England to support local wool trade. So in one fell swoop, your head became a tiny patriotic billboard. What a time to be a scalp. Let's not forget the women. Oh no. Their headgear spiraled into an arms race of conical hennins, those tall, pointed hats that looked like an early prototype for unicorn helmets. Some reached over 2 feet in height and were often anchored with painful wire undercarriages. There were serious discussions in town councils about banning excessively tall hennins, as churches couldn't fit noble women under their arches, and there were reports of hats knocking over hanging lanterns during evening mass. You can imagine the scene. Solemn candlelight, reverent silence, and suddenly, a whoosh, a crash, and the flaming end of Sister Margaret's left sleeve. But if one were really unlucky, or perhaps just unjustly fashionable, they might be summoned to court for inappropriate silken display or fur-trimmed arrogance. These were actual concerns. Sumptuary violations were taken as signs of social upheaval. After all, what would happen if peasants strutted around in brocade? Absolute chaos, presumably, and confusion at dinner parties. As bedtime stretches its yawn further into the shadows, let's pause and thank our modern closets, where you can wear mismatched socks and no one declares it treason. Now, let us gently draw the curtain and drift toward the next curious corner of medieval life, where even your garden gnome probably had better manners than some nobles at the table. Picture a medieval town at dusk. Cobbled streets curl like sleepy question marks, faintly lit by oil-burning lanterns too stubborn for their low wattage. A scent of wood smoke and damp wool drifts through the air, mingling with the faintest sounds of someone attempting to play the lute badly. Either that, or a cat is in distress. This evening, let's wander through one of the more curiously enforced customs of the Middle Ages. The law of curfew. No, not the kind that teenagers defy and parents lament. This was less about sneaking in after a dance and more about extinguishing open flames before your neighbor's house became your entire block's barbecue. The word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, or cover fire, and that's exactly what townsfolk were compelled to do. Cover their hearth fires with an iron lid, douse the sparks, and essentially kiss personal warmth goodbye at an hour preordained by the ruling lot. The city's great bell would ring to signal it was time to snuff the flames, plump the straw mattress, and consider whether tomorrow's bread ration would be made with grain or wishful thinking. The reasoning was practical on the surface. Most medieval homes were made of timber, unfavorable roofing materials and hope. Fire spread like gossip in a monastery. One errant ember could leap from hearth to hayloft like a caffeinated squirrel, engulfing entire neighborhoods before anyone had time to shout, "Fetch water," particularly because the well was probably locked after hours. For security, naturally. But beyond fire safety, curfew had another layer. After lights out, social order was presumed to return to its proper, stratified shape. Darkness belonged to monks, burglars, and owls. If you were out past curfew and had no acceptable excuse, like being caught in an unusually long prayer or stuck in a philosophical conversation about geese, then you might be accused of vagrancy, paganism, or other entirely nebulous crimes invented to keep the peace via fear-based bedtime routines. The curfew bell itself was no gentle chime. It was a resounding croak from some cathedral, or a bellow from the town's central tower, a noise no one could ignore, even if they tried. It echoed over thatched roofs and through alleyways, prompting a symphony of clattering shutters and muttered complaints, much like how one feels when the Wi-Fi goes out today. Now, some took the rule very seriously. In certain English towns, the regulation included not just the when of fire snuffing, but the how. Municipal codes from the 13th century dictated that the fire must be safely covered beneath an iron lid, lest anyone opted for, say, aggressive wagging of a blanket or optimistic whistling. It was said, quite humorously, that failing to properly extinguish your hearth could lead to fines, or worse, public shaming by being labelled reckless with flame. One can only imagine the medieval equivalent of this, perhaps being forced to wear a hat shaped like a chimney paraded before the town geese. Still, some townsfolk resisted. A few rebellious souls kept embers glowing secretly beneath ash, coaxing them back to life after the official curfew. These were the night bakers and clandestine beer brewers, heroes of yeast and fermentation, legally grey but morally delicious. Others took it a step farther and simply ignored the curfew entirely, counting on the general chaos of the era to spare them from punishment. After all, if the sheriff wasted his time inspecting fireplaces, who would chase the pig thieves? As centuries shuffled forward and building materials improved slightly, clay tiles replacing flammable thatch, and fewer people leaving their doors open to wandering sheep, the curfew law slowly lost its grip. By the Renaissance, towns grew brighter, fires became less threatening, and the people became busier writing poetry about fruit and inventing embroidery that looked like small battles. But even now, the ghost of the curfew bell lingers in our sleepy rituals, shutting off the lights, turning down the bedspread, setting out our clothes for tomorrow, or a sword if you're particularly optimistic or easily startled. So next time you feel the urge to light a candle past midnight, remember, in the Middle Ages, that single flame could land you a fine, or worse, a neighbourly glare from a man who still thinks stonemasonry is a competitive sport. And speaking of peculiar local ordinances, imagine a time when people were fined for wearing the wrong kind of hat, in the wrong kind of weather, with just a touch too much lace. Let's tiptoe quietly into that curious world. Imagine, if you will, the wind whispering softly through the moss-draped trees of a medieval English village, the scent of damp hay and boiled turnips gently seasoning the air. And somewhere, off in the distance, a cow sneezes. We now find ourselves amid the curious world of medieval livestock law. Yes, livestock law. Because while knights galloped, queens plotted, and jesters juggled questionable moral boundaries, everyday folk were busy following genuinely baffling rules governing their animals. Let's take a brisk but breezy walk through the charming absurdities of medieval barnyard bureaucracy. To begin, you may think of pigs as sweet, mud-loving oinkers, but in medieval times, pigs were urban menace number one. In most European towns, pigs roamed freely, loafing in alleys, rooting in gardens, occasionally attempting light burglary. But when one particularly boisterous pig trampled a child in a French village, the local townspeople decided they'd had enough of porcine anarchy. Thus came a bold new rule. Pigs in town must wear trousers, or more precisely, they had to be outfitted in a snout binding and a restraining harness that passed for porcine formal wear. This outfit was meant to prevent rooting, biting, or hog-wild behavior in the marketplace. Naturally, compliance varied, and pigs being pigs, many simply wriggled free and returned to their muddy crimes. Meanwhile, over in Switzerland, cows became the unlikely stars of a courtroom drama. You see, Middle Ages law held that animals could be tried in court like humans. If a cow trampled a man or a goat gave someone a particularly malevolent stare, into court they went. Witnesses were called, arguments made, and occasionally execution scheduled. The real legal twist: a defense attorney was provided. Yes, an actual human being had to argue thoughtfully on behalf of a goat named, say, Beatrix, who had willfully and with intent to menace a baker. Why did they do this, you ask through a yawn? Because people truly believe that justice must be served thoroughly, even to quadrupeds. It's scandalously beautiful in a muddled sort of way. Back in England, donkeys were largely left to their own devices, but the sheep, oh the sheep, were wrapped in red tape so tightly they barely had room to bar. In one region, a law mandated that all wool sheared in spring must first be weighed and inspected by the local wool reeve, a man who was essentially a bureaucratic shepherd. If the fleece was deemed too floppy or unduly slubby, those are not technical terms but should be, it needed to be rinsed in elderflower water and re-spun under supervision. These rules weren't merely invented out of mischief. Wool was England's economic pride, a fluffy pillar of finance. Crooked fleece could ruin a merchant season. So while you dozed off dreaming of cozy blankets, somewhere a man in a floppy hat took inventory of your pillow's ancestors. Of course, animal rules didn't only dwell in law books and courtrooms. They snaked into royal palaces too. For example, in one particularly odd chapter of the French court, King Louis IX issued a decree stating that no cat could walk uninvited across royal dining tables. This would not be notable, except the punishment was exile to the stables for a cat. We must assume the cats did not take the ruling seriously, as cats have a famously lukewarm relationship with human authority. Still, the court's feline bailiff, assigned to enforce the rule, was likely the most frustrated employee in the kingdom. One might imagine that with all these animal edicts fluttering about, some medieval folks tried to push their luck, and indeed, clever peasants occasionally disguised illegal piglets as small dogs to avoid swine taxes. There's at least one record of a particularly brave piglet wearing a woolen bonnet and being introduced as Lady Barkweather. Rules changed, of course. Kings fell, towns grew, and pigs were eventually banned altogether from city streets, except under securely leashed circumstances. But for a time, just a strange and dreamy window of time, animals had legal identities, fashion accessories, and moments in court grander than certain nobles. Now, close your eyes and picture a nighttime barn in the countryside, the walls aglow from the moonlight, and a donkey softly chewing hay while a rooster mutters bedtime gossip. The laws may have faded, but their nonsense still echoes on the breeze. And speaking of breezes, let's follow the next one to a far more glamorous rule. This one involving shoes, status, and the scandal of pointy toes. In the stillness of a medieval village, just as the mist curled like sleepy cats around moss-covered walls, there was a silence not even roosters dared to break. And yet, in this hush of dawn, a single sound might echo from the market square, the faint, unmistakable chime of a bell, followed by an entirely unnecessary shout, "Bread, identical in size, no cheating." Yes, dear listener, in some dusty corners of medieval Europe, bakers were subject to a curious litany of regulations. Among them, the assize of bread and ale, a law so specific and so sternly enforced, it could turn any cheerful dough slinger into a nervous, flour-dusted mathematician. Passed in 13th century England under King Henry III, this law ensured that every loaf of bread had to weigh exactly as much as the law required, not more, not less. And woe betide the baker who dared to underdeliver. Selling short-weight bread was not only fined, it could land a person in the medieval equivalent of reality TV jail, the pillory. Imagine it. A puzzled, slightly overwhelmed baker, arms crossed and covered in rye, dragged to the market square and perched in a wooden contraption built more for dramatic birds than for justice. Passers-by could throw mouldy vegetables if they wished, or simply frown deeply in disappointment. Nothing says quality control like a communal vegetable volley. And should your bread not be the right size, your ale not the right strength, well, then you were meddling dangerously with what was considered divine order. In fact, regulating bread and ale wasn't just about fairness. It was about cosmic balance. Too little ale could weaken souls. Too much might summon a tavern brawl involving at least one lute and a goose. Somewhere in between, utopia. But the world of regulated carbs was not the only realm with strange restrictions. In this same medieval landscape, there appeared one of the oddest legal concoctions of all, the sumptuary laws. These were laws dictating what people could or could not wear, based on their social class. Because naturally, the most pressing crisis of the 14th century was the horror of a merchant wearing ermine. Let us consider the beleaguered wool merchant. Perhaps business was booming. Perhaps his coin purse jingled more than was polite. But if he dared knit himself into a velvet tunic trimmed with squirrel fur? No, that was noble wear. And unless your ancestors had a castle, a falcon, or at least a tapestry featuring a boar hunt, those threads were politically inappropriate. The rationale was equal parts fashion and feudalism. Clothing, you see, was a visual extension of the medieval census. You could spot a knight from a mile off. Gilded cloak, polished greaves, tiny wind chimes of authority in every jingle. Now imagine society's horror if a particularly ambitious fishmonger dressed the same. Better to outlaw the confusion. One of the more absurd extensions of these laws involved shoes, specifically the length of your pointy shoe toes. Nobility were allowed the longest, up to 2 feathery feet long, curling upward like a ridiculous question mark. A lord's social standing could, quite literally, trip him in the street. These shoes were called poulaines. And yes, they required special garters to anchor them to your legs to avoid dramatic face plants. Peasants, by the way, were limited to modest, practical footwear, likely more suitable for actual walking. Not that the nobility were walking much. They'd have a page boy to carry their poulaines for them if need be. Just imagine the guild debates, conducted over warm ale and half-laced breeches. Good sirs, I propose an amendment. Let the merchant class have 7-inch shoe tips and no more. Now, regulating clothing might seem whimsical, even quaint, but it also exposed deep anxieties about order, station, and power. The Middle Ages were deeply concerned with knowing one's place, honoring invisible lines drawn not in ink, but in wool, leather, and the occasional pretentious hat. And speaking of hats, some cities, particularly in Italy, passed laws requiring prostitutes to wear distinct clothing, red sleeves or striped veils to mark their trade, all so that a gentleman might sin with clarity and still claim moral high ground. So the next time you pull on unmatched socks or loaf around in sweatpants from suspiciously regal fabric, spare a thought for our medieval forebears and the rules that kept them exquisitely, unnecessarily in their social lanes. Now, gently set your shoes, of any pointiness, beside the bed. Tuck in just a little, tighter, and let us wander toward the flickering torchlight of yet another curious custom. In the quaintly confusing patchwork that was medieval Europe, regulations didn't always come with explanations. Some seemed invented on a particularly bored Tuesday by a duke with too much mead and not enough hobbies. And so, nestled within the stone walls of daily life, strange rules bloomed like wildflowers, unpredictable, a bit unruly, and yet somehow accepted by everyone trudging through the mud in woolen socks. One such rule, and this is absolutely real, concerns bread. Yes, bread. Glorious, crusty, blessedly beige bread. In 13th century England, a law called the Assize of Bread decreed exactly how much a loaf of bread should weigh and how much bakers could charge for it. Too light a loaf, and bakers could face severe penalties, including fines, time in the stocks, or the slightly more humiliating bread cart ride, in which a dishonest baker was dragged through the streets with a sign around his neck that read something quite unkind, like cheapskate crust dealer. Why the drama over bread? Because, dear listener, people were very serious about not being hungry, and to avoid being punished, bakers developed a clever precaution, the famous baker's dozen. That's right, 13 loaves instead of 12. An extra loaf, just in case one was underweight, and some official with an overly accurate scale came lurking around the ovens with an agenda. You see, medieval officials loved weighing things. Weighing bread, weighing people accused of witchcraft, weighing the town crier's new bell. Sometimes they weighed pigs for fun. Sometimes they weighed pigs for taxes, a system called pannage, which is both adorable and wildly inefficient. But back to bread. At first, you'd think the Assize of Bread was a shining example of food justice, regulating commodities to protect the common folk. And you'd be right, until you discover it included such delightful charting as how much a penny could buy based on the price of wheat, the moon's emotional state, and whether or not the baker's goose had laid a good breakfast egg that morning. In short, it was complex. Not to mention, flour quality varied widely. Today, you might get mildly miffed about a lumpy pancake mix. In medieval times, your flour might contain bits of chalk, ground beans, or possibly the remains of the miller's bad attitude. So you can see why some regulation was needed, even if unenforced on cloudy mornings. The assize wasn't only for bread, mind you. It also included ale. Ah yes, ale, the murky lifeblood of medieval hydration. Since water often carried enough bacteria to spark an entire drama series, people drank ale from sunrise to bedtime. Basically, alcoholic herbal tea with a job to do. The assize of ale aimed to ensure every tankard was sold fairly, tasted pleasant, and didn't knock a man off his goat with a single sip. To enforce the rules, Towns appointed ale conners, individuals whose entire job was to go from tavern to tavern, sip the ale, and judge it. Yes, professional beer tasters, with the power of the crown. It was likely the most envied job in the Shire, except on festivals involving pickled eels. However, ale conners had responsibilities beyond quaffing. There's some evidence that they tested ale by sitting in it. Allegedly, they'd pour some onto a wooden bench, then sit in leather trousers and wait. If the ale made their breeches stick, it was considered too sweet, and probably filled with extra sugar, which was forbidden. If they stood up cleanly, the ale passed muster, and the tavern keeper could go back to his game of pretend the stew has meat in it. Now, of course, sitting in beverages as a compliance test might sound absurd. Actually, it definitely is absurd. But remember, this was a world where bells had curfews, pigs needed passports, and dancing on Sundays was considered a possible path toward eternal doom, particularly if you smiled while doing it. By candlelight in a village far from any castle, these rules quietly hummed in the background as daily life shuffled along. Bakers kneaded dough with cautious optimism. Tavern keepers offered their brews to skeptical ale conners, and somewhere, a bureaucrat in a feathered cap was probably drafting a new amendment about carrot curvature guidelines. And as the village gently settled into its evening rituals, dogs curling by the hearth, hens muttering the world's oldest gossip, the rules kept ticking along, strange but steady. Just ahead, we meet the poor souls who tried to break those rules, and the occasionally mad but creative punishments that followed. Another turn in the crooked lane of medieval logic. If you were a medieval peasant, and statistically speaking, you probably would have been, you spent your days toiling under the gracious watch of your local lord, dodging plagues, avoiding questionable stew, and patiently waiting for St. Monday, which wasn't actually a holy day at all, but a delightfully unofficial excuse not to show up to work after Sunday ailings. And of course, there were rules, delightfully specific, occasionally bonkers rules, that governed everything from your shoes to your soup. But among the strangest of these directives was the bizarre world of sumptuary laws, a kind of medieval fashion police with an axe to grind and a keen eye for velvet. Sumptuary laws, in case you aren't a regular reader of dusty royal proclamations, were rules dictating who could wear what. Yes, these were literal laws about clothing, issued by kings, queens, and occasionally bishops, with very strong feelings about sleeves. At their core, they were meant to reinforce the social order. You must dress your station, and your station must be dressed humbly. If you were a knight, for instance, you were permitted a modest amount of fur. Not too much, mind, lest you start resembling a baron. If you were a merchant who'd gotten just a little too successful, waltzing about in silk doublets with buttons made of jet, you might find yourself summoned, sternly, to tone it down. Cloth of gold, reserved for royalty. Velvet, only if your income crossed a suspiciously specific threshold. Pearls, ask your local magistrate, preferably while avoiding eye contact. The concern, you see, was that the rising merchant and artisan classes were beginning to look altogether too comfortable. They'd struck deals and flipped spices across Europe like they were selling hot buns, and now they dared to swan about with hats so wide they could shade a cow. This could not stand. England's King Edward III was notoriously fussy on this subject. In the 1300s, he enacted a particularly chatty sumptuary law, outlining what fabrics and furs could be worn by which class of citizen. The gist of it: if you weren't landed gentry, don't even think about lining your hood with squirrel. And yes, squirrel fur, called ver, was an actual status symbol. Nobles swanned about wrapped in the pelts of aristocratic rodents, while commoners made do with wool, and perhaps the occasional sniff of rabbit. In Italy, things got even spicier. The city of Florence issued so many sumptuary laws in the 14th century that historians joke they were Italy's version of Instagram filters, except instead of enhancing your look, they legally prevented it. One law limited the number of buttons a woman could have on her dress. Another banned long trains on wedding gowns, unless you were marrying into one of a few select families, because nothing says blessed union quite like a punitive 3-foot limit on your bridal hemline. The French, meanwhile, dove into fashion legislation with delicious gusto. Under Charles VI, even hose was regulated. Yes, hose, as in the snug, hip-hugging legwear that delighted painters and scandalized morality watchdogs alike. If your legs were too tightly sheathed in colors reserved for nobility, you might find lawmen politely asking you to remove your pants in the name of social justice. But despite their ridiculousness, sumptuary laws weren't just about fashion faux pas. They were a flimsy dam, trying to hold back the rising tide of class mobility. As wealth no longer belonged solely to the bloodlines of old, appearance became the last stronghold of the elite. A merchant might own a fleet of cargo ships, but if he wore the wrong hat, he could be fined, denounced, or made to stand in church with sheepish humility, while his outfit was mocked by a legally empowered friar. And still, the people rebelled in the most charming way, with excess buttonholes, secret linings of velvet, overly puffed sleeves that defied both gravity and regulation. Families passed down cherished accessories like relics. This pearl brooch once belonged to your great-aunt Marjorie. She wore it to the market on a dare and got slapped with a 7-shilling fine. Eventually, enforcement waned. The nobility grew distracted. Civil wars, religious upheaval, the invention of relatively interesting furniture, and the rising merchant class did what humans tend to do. They dressed how they pleased, with a dash more burgundy each season. But for a time, there was a world where the width of a belt, the glint of a seam, or the daring angle of a feather could tip the social scales. Funny, isn't it, how we humans fuss endlessly over the outer wrapping, even as the soup inside bubbles all the same. Speaking of soup, our next tale leads us to the very odd laws surrounding mealtime etiquette, and how a spoon could start a scandal. As the flicker of candlelight danced along the rough stones of a medieval wall, we drift now into the curious world of sumptuary laws, a delightful example of how governments once tried and routinely failed to regulate fashion with the same sternness they assigned to treason. You see, in many parts of medieval Europe, there was a deeply rooted terror that commoners might start dressing like nobles. The social hierarchy depended on visual cues. If Philip the Baker started looking like Sir Geoffrey the Knight, how on earth was a baron supposed to know whom to ignore at a feast? To combat this unravelling of aesthetic order, the ruling classes invented sumptuary laws, official decrees that told people exactly what they could and could not wear. And they were very serious about it. Extremely serious. Once, in 1363, England's Parliament passed a law stating that no servant, farmer, or lower-class fellow could wear cloth that cost more than 2 shillings per yard. Even worse, they were explicitly banned from wearing silk, ermine, or fancy foreign hoods, with a particularly passionate ban on squirrel fur. Yes, squirrel. Apparently, certain varieties of European squirrel had coats so luxurious, so outrageously posh, they had to be legally quarantined away from the peasantry, A little rodent, scampering about completely unaware of the social scandal its fur could cause. In Florence, the laws took a more mathematical turn. Officials tracked not only what citizens wore, but how many garments they owned, how much they cost, and how much embroidery was on them. Heaven forbid your doublet sport more than 14 inches of gold thread. That was the metric used, by the way. Literal inches of opulence. If you were caught violating these finery faux pas, you might be fined, humiliated, or even forced to strip away your stylish rebellion on the spot. There are tales of inspectors discreetly posted near marketplaces, peering suspiciously at velvet sleeves or counting pearl-studded buttons as they passed. And here's the dreamy twist. While these laws were written with all the solemnity of Holy Scripture, enforcement was hilariously erratic. On one hand, a merchant's wife might be penalized for daring to wear a crimson sash outside her station. On the other hand, the local noble's cousin's cousin's cousin might strut past in entire coats stitched with silver thread, waving cheerfully while completely violating half the wardrobe code. The general public, of course, found ways around it. Creative tailoring was born, with hidden luxury linings only visible to the wearer. Some folks simply bribed their way into lace and finery. Others pleaded ignorance. "Oh, this old squirrel. I thought it was mole." And in some towns, officials found themselves drowning in the sheer complexity of their own rules. Should purple silk be banned for all but the nobility? Well, what about lilac? Mauve? What if it was dyed twice? What if it was a gift? Are sequins acceptable if sewn on by a monk? The absurd bureaucracy eventually became too tiresome even for the enforcers. At one point in England, a proclamation forbade any man under the rank of knight from wearing pikes on his shoes longer than 2 inches. Shoemakers discreetly provided adjustable toe extenders. Yes, medieval shoe hacks, so the daring could click them on when distant from town watchmen, and unclick them when sensibility returned. Amidst this curious chaos stood the humble tailor, who, with a bit of needlework and discretion, became the gatekeeper of not just fashion, but subtle rebellion. If the button count must not exceed 10, well then, button 11 could nestle quietly beneath a flap. Embroidery could cleverly imitate the look of gold thread using humble flax and a patient hand. Style, after all, exists to be chased, and sometimes cleverly hidden. The result was an ongoing cat-and-mouse game between ambition and authority, woven quite literally into the fabric of daily life. As your mind begins to wander through these velvet-lined loopholes and forbidden furs, imagine a world where your outfit could get you arrested or admired from a safe distance, not because it was tacky, but because it sparkled just a bit too brightly for your station. A time when one had to choose between expressing oneself or evading the gaze of a fashion inspector with a tape measure and a mild superiority complex. Soon, we'll drift into the curious culinary commandments that shaped mealtime hour by hour, bite by regulated bite. But for now, let the whispers of gilded sleeves and secret linings lull you gently beneath your covers, where no one will ever subpoena your pajamas. By the flickering warmth of a candle stub on a stone windowsill, let's wander now into the curious world of medieval justice, or more accurately, justice's slightly confused, overly theatrical cousin. Picture it, a sleepy village nestled in 14th century France, where peasants tilled the fields, nobles tilted at each other in tournaments, and pigs occasionally stood trial for murder. Yes, pigs. In certain parts of Europe, animals were not immune to the long, wagging finger of the law. Medieval courts, being endlessly imaginative, held firmly that if a pig, dog, or even a particularly aggressive rooster committed a crime, say, munching on a forbidden truffle or nibbling a child's unattended toe, it deserved a fair trial. A proper one too, with judges, witnesses, and occasionally a court-appointed defense lawyer. Now, this wasn't some metaphorical pageantry or commentary on human folly. These were serious proceedings. A 1386 case in Falaise, France, made a particularly lasting impression on the annals of peculiar jurisprudence. A sow was accused of infanticide. Gruesome, yes, and after a solemn trial, she was declared guilty, dressed in human clothes, and hanged by the neck until justice, or something likened to it, was done. To our modern ears, this seems absurd, perhaps darkly comedic. But consider the medieval mind. The Church believed all creatures were part of God's great plan, and thus, when one strayed from its divine role, accountability must follow, lest the very fabric of moral order fray like an old tunic. Plus, there was always the possibility of demonic possession. That pig might not be evil. It might just be temporarily possessed. You know, as one gets. Still, not all animals had to fear the gavel. Some, in fact, received better treatment than their human counterparts. In Switzerland, in 1474, a rooster was put on trial simply for the suspicious act of laying an egg. Reasonable suspicion, the court thought. Perhaps it was a cunning demon in disguise, a male bird defying its ordained biology to lay a vessel of sorcery. The horror. The rooster, alas, lost his case and his head. Now imagine being the bailiff on rooster execution duty. One assumes it wasn't a popular post. Behind all this feathered and porcine litigation, we must remember that medieval people didn't lack intelligence. They merely operated within a worldview vastly different from ours, and perhaps, for lack of nightly distraction, indulged a fondness for theatrical bureaucracy. After all, when the highlight of your week is market day and your best entertainment is watching someone spoon out gruel with more enthusiasm than usual, a dramatic trial, even of a goat, adds real excitement. You might think this kind of animal accountability only applied to barnyard mischief, but not so. Insects were also frequent defendants. Locusts in Switzerland were excommunicated, yes, ecclesiastically banned, by entire towns. Monks would gather in cloisters to read stern prayers, urging the pest to vacate the crops, or else. Quite what "or else" meant for a locust remains unclear. Presumably, the swarm sat in the wheat, shrugging its invisible insect shoulders. This brings us to the deeply satisfying absurdity of sin and structure intertwining. In their fusion of faith and law, medieval societies gave moral texture even to creatures who had no business making moral decisions. To us, that feels wildly surreal. But to them, it provided order, a psychological safeguard against chaos. If even a goose could be held accountable, perhaps the world wasn't quite so unpredictable after all. Of course, this legal latitude didn't extend to everyone. Human defendants often fared no better. Trials by ordeal, burning, drowning, gnawing were common. But perhaps the animals, with their silent resistance and blank stares, fared better than the peasants. Now curl up under your blanket, snug in the knowledge that although today's society has its quirks, at least our cats can't be subpoenaed for knocking over a teacup, even if it was quite clearly premeditated. And as the stars continue their quiet rotation over old castles and forgotten barnyards, let us tiptoe toward another oddly shaped corner of the medieval mind, a place where rules about hats, height, and horn-playing await us. The streets of medieval towns were not particularly known for their cleanliness or charm. If you can imagine cobblestones slick with things better left undescribed, you're already halfway to understanding the kind of rules that sprang up to keep society from descending entirely into chaos, or at least to prevent everyone from slipping in yesterday's soup. Let us stroll quietly down a winding alley in 14th century York, England. The sun has just dipped below the thatched rooftops, casting long sleepy shadows, and a faint aroma of baked bread competes aggressively with the less alluring bouquet of civic life. Now, just as you're admiring a fine wooden sign swaying above a shop, you notice something in the gutter. It's moving, slowly, very slowly. That's a pig. Yes, dear listener. In medieval towns, pigs often roamed the streets like remarkably chubby nuisances on four hooves. And because pigs were seen not only as food, but as living garbage disposals, many city dwellers let them wander to clean up scraps. Of course, pigs are not known for their table manners, and thus entire ordinances were created simply to regulate their piggish activities. In Paris around the year 1131, a surprisingly escalative incident forced the king to ban pigs from wandering the streets. A pig, it seems, waddled into the path of a galloping horse. The horse, startled, threw its young rider, a lad by the name of Prince Philip. Unfortunately, this tale does not have a happy oink. The young prince perished. Afterward, both pigs and royal public transportation systems were viewed with a colder eye. Some towns required that any pig wandering free wear a little bell. Yes, a bell, like a bovine concierge with poor impulse control. The bell would announce the pig's presence and perhaps give you just enough time to leap into a puddle to avoid being lovingly nuzzled by its muddy snout. This all brings us rather smoothly to another everyday enforceable oddity: medieval sumptuary laws. These, in effect, were fashion rules enforced by governments who utterly refused to let peasants look too fabulous. To the modern eye, these might seem like a whimsical dress code from a particularly lopsided party planner. But the logic, you see, was this: only certain people could wear certain fabrics, colours, or accessories. Nobles got velvet and pearls. Middle-class folks got wool and stern glances. Commoners, well, wool again, but less flattering wool. It wasn't simply about aesthetics. These laws were meant to preserve social order, which is shorthand for reminding everyone who was allowed in the velvet circle and who had to stay in the itchy wool moat. In England, under the reign of Edward III, rules were quite precise. Only the royal family could wear ermine fur. If you were caught in forbidden textiles, the punishment could be severe, including having the clothes publicly removed. Imagine being not just underdressed, but unceremoniously peeled like a fashion onion for daring to don silk in the wrong postcode. And if you're imagining wardrobes bursting into flames at the sight of an upstart tailor with too many ruffles, well, that's only slightly exaggerated. For a brief and glorious moment in the 14th century, some German towns declared that even shoes were conceited. The infamous Poulain shoes, those long, pointy-toed kicks that resembled the architectural ambitions of cathedrals, were banned on certain days or for certain people. The longer the toe, the higher the rank, or the greater the likelihood of tripping over your own status. Now, lest this all seem too grim, it's worth remembering how gloriously humans have always attempted to outwit even their most ridiculous constraints. One nobleman cleverly stitched forbidden gold thread into the lining of his cloak, invisible from the outside, but immensely satisfying to know about inside. A peasant woman in Florence was reportedly fined not for wearing too much silk, but for wearing it too well, and was advised to wear sackcloth, until the magistrate recovered from whatever fashion-induced heart attack he'd suffered. Ah, society, ever a dance between rules and mischief, between pigs in bells and men in pointy shoes playing hide-and-seek with dignity. But for now, let's wander onward. There's another strange rule waiting just beyond the next heavy oak door, where whispers of medieval dining customs might just surprise you even more sweetly than a gilded pig on a cobbled lane. When discussing the unconventional rules of the Middle Ages, there's a special drawer labelled unnecessarily complicated, and nestled deep inside that drawer is the medieval concept of sumptuary laws. Yes, even personal fashion became a matter of legal scrutiny, where velvet trousers could trigger a scandal, and owning too many feathers was practically a felony. These laws were not just meant to keep people from looking too fancy. They were rich in their own special brand of logic. The basic idea was to preserve the social hierarchy using clothing as armor for the elite. After all, if a butcher began dressing like a baron, society might collapse into utter chaos. Cats would cease to fear dogs, peasants might take up interpretive dance, and somewhere a nobleman's monocle would fall gently into his goblet of mead. So medieval towns kept close watch on who wore what. In 14th century Florence, for example, the city council passed so many ordinances policing dress codes that you'd think they were running a Kucha police force rather than a republic in peril. Wearing silk, that was fine, if you were a noble or married to one. If you were, say, a candle maker with a taste for brocade, you'd be fined faster than you could say, "Is this velvet?" Shoes, too, were a suspicious accessory. There was a brief, glorious period when the fashionable shoe of the day sported long, curved toes, known as poulaines, that stuck out like a duck's beak in mid-yawn. These shoes were so long they had to be tied to one's legs with little chains to prevent tripping over one's own ostentation. Sumptuary laws eventually limited toe length according to status. Common folk could strut around with cheerful little 5 inches, while nobles might extend their ambitions to a downright dangerous 2 feet. Because apparently, dignity is partially measured in how much shoelace can be used to secure one's feet to the ground. Hairstyles weren't spared either. At one point, French women were forbidden from wearing elaborate horn-shaped headdresses unless they belonged to a certain class. These towering contraptions resembled upright croissants and often scraped ceilings as they passed through doorways, like a regal giraffe checking into an inn. It was said one could tell the wealth of a woman by the height of her hat, an early ancestor perhaps, of the modern stiletto heel. And let's not forget the middle-age obsession with sleeves. Ah yes, sleeves. The longer and more dramatic the better. Sleeves flounced, sleeves flowed, sleeves dragged through mud and soup with equal flair. Eventually, some enterprising towns introduced sleeve taxes, because when sleeves are wide enough to double as picnic blankets, someone's bound to monetize them. Naturally, these laws were flaunted and broken with inspiring enthusiasm. After all, what's the point of being alive in a feudal system if you can't occasionally pose as a duke at the tavern? Enforcement became its own comedy. Tipsy tailors and over-eager watchmen often couldn't tell silk from satin after dusk, and it was not unheard of for ambitious merchants to wear contraband cloth under their approved tunics, like smugglers of swank. But behind the frills and follies was a deeper tale. Clothing, for many medieval people, was their only visible badge of aspiration, an identity. A baker with embroidered cuffs might not have been seeking rebellion, but respect. A miller's wife slipping into crimson velvet wasn't trying to start a coup. She just wanted to feel like royalty, if only for a moment. It was fashion as feudal resistance, and resistance, remarkably, often came with tassels. Sumptuary laws would hobble along for centuries, flaring up during times of economic imbalance, then fading like a spoiled hemline when the rich got bored policing the sleeves of the poor. In the end, the world moved on. Nobles got distracted by more profitable pursuits like spices and shipbuilding, and everyone else sighed with relief as they wore what they pleased, even if it was occasionally leopard print. Far beyond the lace and linen, these odd laws whisper a very human truth. People have always longed to express, impress, and sometimes just feel fabulous for no good reason at all. And somewhere in the moonlit fog of a distant hamlet, a tailor dreams nightly of sewing 12-foot sleeves without the threat of a citation. Now just tiptoe with me through the candlelit corridors of medieval custom, because something very odd is waiting by the well. In the wobbly corridors of medieval etiquette, one curious corridor led straight into the baffling universe of sumptuary laws. Now, if you've never heard of sumptuary laws, imagine a committee of extremely judgmental tailors, bishops, and tax collectors forming a group specifically to tell you, no, you may not wear squirrel fur because you're a commoner and your shoes are too pointy. Yes, pointy shoes. Let us begin there. During the 14th century, a most ridiculous fashion caught fire among the nobility. Elongated shoes known as poulaines. These were not mere shoes. These were shoe swords. Some curled up, some jutted out, and some were stuffed with moss for support, like a medieval orthopedic nightmare. The longer your poulaine, the higher your social standing, which allowed some noblemen to teeter along in footwear with snouts so long they had to be tied to the knee with a ribbon just to walk. Predictably, this did not go over well with those in power. Archbishops clutched their rosaries. Kings furrowed their regal brows. So, sumptuary laws were enacted, rules that carefully dictated the proper length of a shoe based on your birthright. If you were a peasant, a modest toe peep was all you were granted. A knight, perhaps a humble 2 inches. Royalty could flaunt 8 inches or more, presumably with a small spotlight and possibly a choir. And it didn't stop at footwear. Oh, not even close. You see, the elite were very worried that the lower classes were beginning to look fashionable. Heaven forbid that your village fishmonger be mistaken for a baron simply because he looked dashing in blue wool. Thus bloomed a series of legislative doodlings claiming which fabrics, colours and accessories were acceptable for each social tier. Silks were reserved for the upper crust, velvet for the crust just beneath. Ermine fur was nearly sacred, wrapped only around the shoulders of those with enough land or titles, or ideally, some combination, including a bishopric. And lest you think these rules were merely decorative, nuisances, violators were treated with a sternness usually reserved for counterfeiters and scandalous jesters. Imagine being dragged before a local magistrate because your belt had too many silver studs. No, Geoffrey the cobbler, your waist does not qualify for gold thread embroidery, and your hat plume is frankly an insult to the realm. Of course, these laws didn't stop people from trying. In one especially poetic case in 14th century Florence, a merchant declared bankruptcy purely because he couldn't stop buying fancier clothes. He was not alone. Across Europe, tailors were embroiled in an endless dance of cat and mouse with the fashion police. There were secret sleeves and hidden linings, illegal buttons crafted behind chapel walls, and even cloaks that looked modest on the outside, but were lined with scandalously sumptuous materials on the inside, like wearing a potato sack that whispered, "Inside I am royalty." The absurdity becomes dreamy when you realize that these, Laws were often updated whenever the ruling classes felt insufficiently special. In England, Edward III passed over a dozen sumptuary laws trying to separate the sartorial sheep from the social goats. Alas, the goats kept buying nice trousers. Now, there were exceptions. People granted permission to wear fancy things for special service to the crown. What constituted special service? Sometimes it was winning a battle. Sometimes it was donating a lot of money. And sometimes it was just knowing the right duke's favourite pigeons. The Middle Ages were like that. Even the church couldn't fully resist the glimmer of luxurious nonsense. While monks and nuns pledged vows of poverty, bishops occasionally slipped into gilded robes so dazzling, peasants assumed they were being visited by saints, or at the very least, interdimensional creatures of silk and sermons. As time shimmered onward, these laws grew increasingly irrelevant, washed away by Renaissance indulgence and tailors with far more ideas than patience. But in the stillness of it all, there's something oddly charming about a world where the hem of your cloak could get you arrested and a shoe tip could spark social revolution. It was a place wound tightly in pride and pretense, where human vanity stitched itself into fabric, one forbidden thread at a time. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the rustle of contraband velvets behind castle walls, the soft swish of scandalous capes in moonlit alleys, and footsteps that echo, a little too long thanks to those pointy poulains. Just ahead, a very different kind of rule awaits, one involving dinner, candles, and how not to offend your host with a spoon. Let's drift that way, slowly, through the twilight of etiquette. Long before the age of inbox overwhelm and 3-minute microwave meals, there lived a particular species of anxiety, medieval guild regulations. Now, in the grand tapestry of human fussing, few threads are more ornate than the rules laid down by the many, many craft guilds of the Middle Ages, organizations where people took shoemaking so seriously that even elves would have felt a bit uptight. Each trade had its own club. Think of it like fantasy football, but with more goose quills and fewer touchdowns. Tanners, weavers, fishmongers, bakers, blacksmiths, all with their own carefully curated codes of conduct. Joining a guild wasn't just a matter of bringing your own bucket of nails and a can-do attitude. You had to first survive an apprenticeship so lengthy that by the time you became a master, your beard had studied abroad twice. Let's pause and imagine Geoffrey, a hypothetical cobbler's apprentice in York, circa 1284. Geoffrey is 10 years old. He dreams not of dragons or glory, but of sharpening his awl to a perfect point. His master, a grim old man known only as Walter the Soul Whisperer, informs him, "You may speak only thrice per day, once for yes, once for no, and once for explaining why you said the wrong one." The training was that intense, but Geoffrey bears it with quiet determination, because once he finishes his apprenticeship and becomes a journeyman, he will then spend years travelling from town to town, polishing his technique and praying his bread doesn't go soggy in his pack, all to eventually be judged by a panel of aging guild masters and earn the right to open a shop of his own, perhaps with a sign hanging outside reading Geoffrey the Cordwainer, now with slightly less blistering, and once you're a guild member. Oh, the meetings. Hours of debate over leather thickness, mold-resistant flour, and whether one may add a hint of clove to their sausage without insulting the ancient recipes of yore. These were not mere hobbyists. Guild members regarded a slightly misshapen barrel with the suspicion normally reserved for sorcery. Take, for example, the stonemasons. Beautifully mysterious folk famous for both cathedral walls and cryptic geometrical doodles. They had rules about everything: how many hours you could work in a day, the precise angles suitable for arch curvature, and, of course, how not to reveal their trade secrets under questioning, presumably including light tickling. Then there were the bakers. In London, the worshipful company of bakers had the legendary assize of bread, a statute regulating the size, price, and weight of loaves. Woe unto he who undersold the king's bread. Loaves found too light were taken and, well, eaten, probably. But it's the public shaming that really takes the wheat cake. Some transgressors were carried through town in a ridiculous cart, with faulty wheels and jeering town criers announcing their offensively airy sponge crumb. It wasn't all punishment and flower-based drama. Guilds provided support too. Pensions, funerals, communal feasts, where someone inevitably brought a rogue cheese. And everything dissolved into a debate about soft rinds. And above all, they provided identity. To say I am a weaver of Norwich was to proclaim not just your skill, but your place in an interlaced fabric of society, slightly itchy though it might be. Still, not all rules were so earnestly enforced. Some were more symbolic, like the rule that no man in the Fishmongers' Guild of London may wear sea serpent motifs unless he had proven he once yelled at a particularly large haddock. Not that anyone checked, but traditions love to parade around wearing absurdity like a feathered hat. These guild codes helped structure society for hundreds of years. Yet as towns grew and trade expanded, newfangled ideas like capitalism and freelancing quietly whispered, maybe we don't need a 17-step approval process for a sharpened scythe. And just like that, the grip of the guilds began to loosen, though not before leaving behind some memorable rules, like the smith's edict that forging a horseshoe while whistling invited divine confusion, and potentially very skittish horses. So if ever you feel stifled by red tape, remember poor Geoffrey, whose every stitch was judged by 5 solemn cobblers in hats tall enough to affect cloud patterns. And now, with cobblers and fishmongers marching off into dreamland, we tiptoe toward one more peculiar puzzle of the Middle Ages, where silence wasn't golden. In fact, it was downright illegal. And so, we drift now to one last curious corner of the Middle Ages, a place where rules were not only enforced by kings and bishops, but sometimes by the squeakiest members of society. Rats. Yes, rats. Tiny whiskered troublemakers with no regard for property law, but somehow often the subject of it. You see, in medieval Europe, if your barn was overrun with rats, or worse, your cheese mysteriously nibbled, you didn't just sigh in despair. Oh no. You maybe took them to court, actual court, in full legal, ritual and regalia. Monks or city officials would summon the rats, by name if they could guess them, telling them to appear in court at a later date, a kind of rodent RSVP. If the rats did not show up, which, shockingly, they often did not, the judge might send an officer to formally evict them, sometimes involving holy water, official scrolls, and something called excommunication from the village granary. Imagine that, a rat being told it is henceforth spiritually banished from the oats, and the rat just blinking up in polite defiance before continuing to chew through your hedge. But this oddity wasn't limited to rats. Pigs were also rather notorious customers in the docket of medieval justice. Pigs, you see, were often kept in towns as a kind of roaming garbage disposal. Unfortunately, some fell into bad company, or off the moral path altogether, and were known to bite or trample people. When this happened, the pig could very well end up imprisoned, dressed in a little cloth smock and charged with murder. One such porcine criminal in 1386 France was sentenced to death for attacking a child, and to deliver proper justice, the judge insisted that the pig be dressed in a blouse and a human mask before execution. Whether this was out of ceremony or satire, we can only guess, but the image is one that surely haunts the dreams of medieval barnyard fans to this day. Even insects weren't exempt from medieval moral positions. Locusts could be excommunicated en masse for devouring crops. Monks would stand in fields waving crosses and reading solemn Latin denunciations to clouds of completely unimpressed bugs. In one famous case, snails were granted safe passage across a monastery's garden, provided they stayed within agreed lanes. The snails, of course, did not honor the lanes, and yet the monks still debated the appropriate consequences. These, dear listener, were the eccentric legal gymnastics of a society obsessed with order, in a world where chaos was always just a rainy afternoon away. But not all rules were outlandishly applied to creatures with wet noses and exoskeletons. Some were reserved for people, especially if you were unlucky enough to be a cook. In 14th century England, there were strict rules about the size of a meat pie. Too small, and a baker could lose a hand. Too large, and suspicion of hoarding abounded. There's an unsettling line somewhere between underfeeding a noble and being branded a glutton's accomplice. In Germany, there were laws requiring members of certain towns to show up to weddings, not as guests, but as official mourners. Yes, mourners, because nothing says congratulations on your eternal union. Quite like weeping in the back corner while wearing your best sackcloth. It was thought to balance the joy and ward off evil spirits who hated a good party. Spirits, we assume, with a poor sense of humor and a complicated relationship with small talk. And let us not forget the rule of roosters in some alpine villages. If a rooster crowed 3 times on a Wednesday while mid-molt, it was believed to herald a scandal. Any local who heard it would be required to confess any small lies they'd told that week. The average villager quickly learned to invest in very quiet hens. It might seem absurd now, all this summoning of snails and putting pigs on trial and letting birds act as feathered lie detectors. But in a world steeped in mystery, with the nights as dark as forgotten thoughts and forests full of suspicious rustling, these rules weren't just laws. They were attempts to make sense of things, to bind daily fears with ribbons of ritual, to tame the unknowable with a good court summons, and, perhaps, a little goat cheese. Now, as the flickering torchlight of our medieval meandering dims, and the dusty parchment of ancient ordinances curls gently at the edges, it's time to rest your thoughts. Let the chattering of old laws fade like distant bells, and the worn cobblestones of forgotten villages drift beneath your dreams. After all, if a pig in a frock coat can find justice, surely you can find sleep. Good night, wanderer of the weird and wonderful past. Tomorrow, perhaps, we return to the waking world. But for now, let the absurdities tuck you in.